welcome Rachel Miller. I can't believe it's taken me over 100 of these to finally get to you, but I'm so excited.
I'm super excited too.
You are like kind of at the cutting edge here, and you're kind of the new scholar, practitioner, critical maker, as we call folks like you at the sort of avant-garde of comic studies. You're also like hugely, you've got all these, you've had all these incredible fellowships. You were the presidential fellow at OSU. You had a scholarship fellowship from Duke. You've got your PhD from OSU, and now you're
finally.
Yay. And you're teaching now at CCAD, right? Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, teaching at CCAD.
Yeah. So anyway, let's hear from like your origin story, your kind of Batman moment, I guess, Rachel, or whatever that looks like.
Cool. Yeah. And thank you for having me. I was so excited to do this because I've been watching them every week. So I was like super psyched that you asked me. But so I always read comics growing up. I have like three kind of like distinct phases of comics in my life where, I was reading like the Sunday funny pages as a kid. And then I was reading manga as like a teenager. And then when I got to college, I was in college in Chicago. And the first week that I was there, I discovered Quimby's, which is like this independent comic book / zine shop on the north side of Chicago. And like at the time I was making my own zines, and I was like, oh, like this is like a whole new world, like independent comics, alternative comics. And it was kind of like an escape from what I was doing academically at the time. So while I was in school, I met, I was coming back like to Ohio during the summers, and one summer I just emailed the Billy Ireland and I asked them if I could go work for them. And they let me come in. I was working on the J. Kennedy collection, which is like an underground alternative comics collection. And it turns out we cataloged it completely incorrectly, but they mentioned to me while I was there that they had just worked with a scholar named Hilary Shute, and that she was going to be teaching at my university. So I went and sought her out and took a class from her. And that was the first class where I was like, oh, I can actually I could study comics in an academic way. She had just published Graphic Women. And then my final year that I was at University of Chicago, she put on this comics convention / academic conference called Comics, Philosophy, and Practice. And I was sitting there on like the opening night and like listening to Art Spiegelman talk about comics, and in the room with like, Alison Bechdel and Lynda Barry and Charles Burns, like all these people whose work I had like discovered over the past couple of years and like was reading and just loving. And I was like, oh, like I could go to grad school and study comics, and I should go to OSU because they have the cartoon library there. And I think comics in Columbus are going to be really big. So that's kind of my origins. A little bit long-winded, but yeah.
No, I love it. I didn't realize the kind of coincidence of circumstance where you were at the Billy and then Hillary took a position at University of Chicago, and then your kind of growth and development within both of those spaces as they interface. That's really awesome. I love it.
Yeah, it was kind of like the right time, right place for all of it. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah. And you've been working on, I know this is a project you've been working on. It's also something, that you're working on at OSU, but also working into a book. Can you tell us about this Girls' Room, Bedroom Culture, Girl Collectors, and the Ephemeral Archive?
Mm-hmm. So this project really started from my own girlhood bedroom, which was like a place, like I used to share my bedroom with my sister for a long time. And then when I got my own space, it was like this laboratory for me, where I was discovering, manga and all these different kinds of comics. And it was just like this place where I was consuming and then like archiving a lot of stuff. I had like posters on my wall, on my ceiling, you know, all this stuff that reflected my interests. And then as I started studying comics at Ohio State, I was noticing that there was a lot of interest in thinking about comics and their archival capacities. So like the ways in which comics kind of reflect back to us consumer cultures or like popular media from eras past. And the comics that I was looking at the time that was really bringing this full circle for me was Ghost World, which is a comic by Dan Clowes that came out in the mid-90s. And it was notable at the time because he was writing about two teenage girls, and he was doing it in this way that was really taking like their lives and their experiences seriously on some level. So from Ghost World, the project has kind of exploded out from there. And I began looking at, you know, all this different media, from film to television to even literature, memoirs, in which the girl's bedroom becomes this archival space, or this way to process girls' relationship to media and culture. And so I also looked at the media that girls were creating in their bedrooms, and I looked at comics and zines during the 1990s. Which, you know, it's just this huge body of work that's being created by young women, kind of in this moment right before, you know, the internet and web blogs become a thing, and social media and all that. So yeah, that's kind of like a little snapshot of the project. There's a lot in there.
I love that, Rachel. And also I love that you're, you know, look, don't get me wrong, Jared, my colleague, and of course, Henry Jenkins, I love their work, and especially kind of, you know, stuff as actually less ephemera and more something that you can learn from, you know, as this kind of pop culture archive, right? And how we archive. But what I love about your work is that you're looking into spaces, places that they don't, right? There's this very like straight kind of dude stuff.
Right. And it's like, I was really interested in the ways that like we can frame young women as collectors, and how they process and collect the ephemera of pop culture differently, and how they navigate that relationship. I was really interested in like what that can tell us about feminism's relationship to mass media, and, you know, just like this relationship between subcultural production and above ground mainstream production. So yeah.
Yeah, a room of one's own, but in such a more vibrant way than we kind of might have conceived of this when I was in graduate school anyway. Right. Really, really exciting work that you're doing in this space, but you are also working in so many other critical maker spaces, including Ariel Schrag. And I know this is also going to be a book, or is becoming a book, but can you tell us about your work with Ariel Schrag and her serializing of a queer girlhood, for instance?
Yeah, so I encountered Ariel Schrag's work when I was working on my comps for my doctorate. So I was reading her comics. She created basically this like 4-part saga of her experiences in high school. So basically what she would do, and she was making this work in like the mid to late 90s, and she would make like her own mini comics for each year that she was, you know, going through high school. She lived out in Berkeley. She was kind of figuring out her sexuality. There are moments throughout the comic where she identifies, you know, as straight or as bisexual, before eventually identifying as a lesbian. And so there's this kind of like fluidity that you can track through the comics. But what I was really interested in was, so she did her first 2 issues, Awkward and Definition. She self-published those. And then she got picked up by a publisher called Slave Labor Graphics, which was a publisher in the like mid-90s that published a lot of like indie stuff. And I encountered the like serials for her third installment, Potential, when I was doing a residency at the Queer Zine Archive Project. And what I was noticing was so she included in those serial comic books, these letter pages. And in those letter pages, she would often have like young men writing in and being like, oh, I see a lot of like potential in your work. I see like all, your line work is kind of sketchy right now, but like it's going to get better. Like you're going to be such a force in comics. And I found this to be really interesting because I was like, well, she's actually already a good artist and storyteller. Like, she doesn't need this caveat of like, her work is going to be good. It's already like established and refined enough. But you do see a progression from the first book through Potential, her third installment, of, where she's refining her line. She's like beginning to understand her storytelling mechanics a little bit better. So I wanted to think about how you could conceptualize of this like very raw kind of way of doing comics, where like you actually do see some growth, or you do see some change in the artist and like it's rapid change over time. And I was thinking about how we could like apply queer theory to that process, because in Potential, she actually mixes two styles, this kind of like cartoony style, which you see on the screen, and then this like much more refined, like hyper realistic style, which I think is what people were picking up on when they were like, oh, like these comics are, I see so much potential in what you're doing. So I was like, actually, I think she's playing with our expectations of like her own potential, and how can we think about that? Like, how can we think about this development not as like linear development towards like I'm becoming a better and better artist, but a more queer development where it's like, my style is circling back on itself. Like I can show you that I can draw in this hyper realistic way, but then we're going to shift registers like a couple pages later, back to this like, more cartoony or like less good style. I don't know. I think that those styles are amazing. So
yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Because you're doing you're kind of taking graphiation and style and the kind of the etching of self in and through that, but bringing a queer lens. I love it. It's amazing.
Yeah, and I was really interested again, like in this process of telling your life as it is happening through a serial medium, because she was publishing these comics like as she is in high school. She like published them knowing that, her classmates and her girlfriends were going to read these comics. So yeah, it's a very like queer way of doing comics for me.
Yeah, and that's, I'm sure for you too, like, hey, whoever just wrote me and told me I'm like coming along okay, you're actually like not the person I'm really like telling my story to. You're like way down on the list of ideal reader, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and that happens a lot with like women in the 90s, is like there's like two ways of writing about their comics, for men, and it's like, oh, I just discovered this person, they're so amazing, or oh, like this person has so much potential. So
Wow. Yeah.
yeah.
I didn't realize it was so obvious.
Yeah.
But yeah, so okay, so and then you're kind of working these other spaces too, which I absolutely love, especially with Diary of a Teenage Girl and Cruddy. Is that how you Cruddy? I guess, right?
Cruddy. Yeah.
Yeah, and so here we are, with, and maybe you can talk a little bit about this too. I teach diary in my Intro to Comic Studies. And a lot of my students are like, well, I don't really see how this is a comic book, but why don't you tell us about your work and diary as body in both of these really incredible kind of works of storytelling?
Yeah, so Diary of a Teenage Girl, and Cruddy, these are two books that came out like towards the end of the 90s and then early 2000s. So Diary of a Teenage Girl by Phoebe Gloeckner and then Cruddy by Lynda. And both of these artists are like we think of them, I guess, as cartoonists, but their work kind of does much more than like straight comics, I guess. And that's certainly true for both of these books, which straddle the lines between like autobiography, memoir, illustrated novel, comics. There are comics included in some cases. So I was interested in thinking about how like this body of text like is so closely aligned with the body of its creator. The body, like representing the body, is extremely central to comics, and particularly like comics that are life writing or like comics drawn by women. The body is like something that like these artists are constantly thinking through and reapproaching. And in both of these texts, which are again not quite comics, not quite novels, like we don't really have a categorization for them, the body of the author is integrated into the text in key ways. So a little spoiler for Cruddy, but at the very end of the text, I won't spoil it too much, but, and we kind of know this from the beginning, but our author goes missing in a way. And she like handwrites, well, we see her sister handwrite at the bottom of the like last chapter, like, where are you, in this like handwritten scrawl. And then in Diary of a Teenage Girl, Gloeckner is using this character Minnie Getz to think about like this relationship that she had as a teenager with her mother's boyfriend, who is an adult. And we see a lot of ways in which her diary becomes this like performative space for her to think about the transgressions that are happening to her body in real life. She writes at the very beginning of the work, like, do not read this, keep out of this, like, this is not, like, I don't want anyone to read this diary, which is a really interesting way to start a published book that people are going to consume. So, you know, I'm interested in the ways that like these texts are so closely aligned with like the violations that these girls experience throughout the works, and also the integration of images into the text. So representing visually the body and its trauma, essentially. And both of them are kind of in a diary format, so there's a lot going on.
Yeah, and then like you were just suggesting, and that you do talk about this kind of ultimately, like, I'm not going to allow you to contain my body. Like, on the one hand, I'm embodying in everything I do here my body, and then at the same time, it's mine, and you don't get it, you know?
Right. Both of the texts, like there is this like inscription of the body on the page, and then this resistance to us consuming and reading that body, that I think we as readers have to like grapple with and be troubled by throughout the text.
So amazing. I'm so glad you're doing this work. You also work on kind of back to sort of archive stuff, but the feminist anthology and its significance, right, in the 80s and 90s. Can you share some of your research in that area?
Yeah, so this project, it grew out of my dissertation, but it became its own like monster, which I'm happy about. But I began this project working at the Queer Zine Archive Project. And there I encountered an anthology comic called Action Girl Comics, which you see on the right-hand side of the screen, the cover for. And Action Girl was an anthology that was run by Sarah Dyer, who was like publishing her own comics, publishing her own zines, but becoming frustrated because a lot of the times when zine reviewers would get her comics, they would misattribute them to her boyfriend, who is also a cartoonist, because she would maybe have him do an interview in her zine or like, you know, help out in some way. So she was getting frustrated with like, you know, like, if this is my work, it's not my boyfriend's. And she began publishing through Slave Labor Graphics, this anthology called Action Girl, as a way to kind of like flood the market with voices that were, you know, women's voices, young girls' voices. And she had this idea that like so she was a zine maker, and she was applying this zine making ethos to those comics. She had this idea like, anyone can make a comic. I want all my readers to be making comics. I want all my readers to be sending me their comics. And what resulted was not just the anthology, but this huge network of correspondence that was like, it was transnational. So she was talking to girls, you know, in the UK, in Canada, and collecting their comics that they would make from seeing Action Girl. And she eventually donated all those comics to the Sally Bingham Center at Duke University. And so I got a grant to work at Duke, thanks to the help of the archivist Kelly Wooten, who runs the zine library there. And what I did was I basically took all of my, by then I had gotten like all the issues of Action Girl, and I took all of them and I built like a spreadsheet that was like, it was all of the contributors and all of the mini comics that were mentioned being associated with those contributors. And then also the mini comics that she would write about in her back pages, like the further reading recommendations that she would make. And I built this huge spreadsheet, and I cross-referenced everything with the archive at Duke. And I pulled all of those comics and read them, scanned them, and it's like just this huge, massive body of work. I think it's like the largest body of work of women's comics in the history of American comics. And again, it's like transnational. There's a huge diversity of voices. Action Girl, you know, is this cis, white, heteronormative figurehead, but the network that she created, you know, is full of queer women, full of women of color, you know, and girls who are like telling these stories that are like very vibrant. So the anthology in the 80s and then into the 90s is really this way to like network. It's like this living archive of this huge body of creators, which again, like we haven't even like scratched the surface of in scholarship. And I'm trying to do that with this work, just trying to like unearth it little by little.
Wow, another book, yeah. Right beyond the article itself. Another book here.
Yes.
I think you need to do a multiplicity machine, Rachel, and get like a couple of you out there doing a bunch of these books that need to happen.
I know, if I can just like on myself, that would be awesome.
So, and I also love this, like the sort of feminist anthology as a kind of transnational room of one's own, right? That's like inviting straight and queer and BIPOC creators, right? You actually are a critical maker practitioner, and you don't just, you know, spend time in archives. You spend time in literally the living, breathing archive that's happening around us, interviewing comics creators. Can you share some of your surprising insights from any of these?
Yeah, I mean, so getting to talk to creators is just like it's like a huge joy for me, because it's like, it gets me like out of my desk, and like I get to actually like interface with people and chat with them. But I think, you know, some of the most interesting insights are about how the work itself gets made, and then how the creator is thinking about like circulating their work. So for example, when I talked to Katie Skelly at SPX like last year, which feels like a million years ago, I learned that she learned color theory by watching YouTube makeup tutorials, which is just like a really fascinating way to educate yourself about how to create comics. And when I was talking to Julie Doucet a couple of years ago, she was talking a lot about like, you know, her early comics, and she would take them to like feminist bookstores around Montreal, and they didn't want them. So she's making these like really like the most feminist comics you could think of, like thinking about gender, sexuality, menstruation, like she's picturing it all. And so, you know, these kind of, this information that I get from artists that I wouldn't find otherwise than just talking to them, you know, it opens up like new questions about well, okay, if feminist bookstores in the 80s and 90s aren't taking comics, like what's the relationship between comics and like, you know, second and third wave feminism? You know, if you have a cartoonist who's learning color theory from YouTube, like how, like there's so much like multiplicity in like that media, you know? So it opens up all these interesting questions that you wouldn't find otherwise.
Yeah, keeps us on our toes too as scholars, right? That
Right.
we sometimes don't, we think we might have figured it out and then we're thrown the curveballs, right?
Yeah, and it's, I mean, I like that. I like to know this stuff. Like, you know, that's why I love working in archives, because it's like you get down to like the very fine grained details of everything. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
yeah.
I love it. So yeah, you've just mentioned Katie Skelly, but so yeah, can you tell us, like, you know, like there seems to me to be a kind of radical, not just renaissance, but like a almost a revolution in comic storytelling. And I feel like it's coming from new gen women, white BIPOC creators like Katie Skelly. Can you comment, or what's your sense of all this?
I mean, I think that like what I love about the new generation of creators, which I not only get to like talk to them at shows and conventions, but I also get to teach them at CCAD. Um, what I love about them is like they don't really abide by the rules. Like they're integrating, you know, so many different kinds of influences. Like Skelly is like, she knows so much about like erotic art. She knows so much about you know, like European cartoonists from like the 70s. So like these very specific influences. And there's kind of like this like sense of like there being no rules in like the, you know, the alternative and indie industry right now. A lot of these creators don't really get hung up on the arguments that I think comics have been having for years, like about, you know, who's in charge or like who likes Marvel comics. They're not interested in any of that. They're interested in, you know, understanding their influences and kind of presenting to us new visions of the world. And those influences like are so unlimited, like everything from YouTube makeup tutorials to like, you know, 90s bad anime is, you know, and I really like, I love getting to know their archives and their personal like set of influences and how that differs from like, you know, these aren't people who are like, oh yeah, like I want to draw like it's Jack Kirby and Phoebe and no one else, you know, like they're like combining Jack Kirby with like, you know, their favorite painter. So yeah, it's exciting.
Yeah, I love it. It's like those meetings that we have as academics, and you're like, why are you talking about something that happened 100 years ago? And having that prevent you from seeing like new possibilities, you know, for whatever it is we're discussing. And they're so frustrating. So you've been teaching in different spaces. You've at you know, places like OSU, 4-year university, in an English department that has, you know, a certain amount of comics studies scholars and comic studies on the books. And then you've also been teaching at CCAD. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the differences between these spaces and some of your methods for teaching comics.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess like the way that I approach teaching comics is similar in both places. Like we start from like a base where it's like, you know, here's like the basic language of comics. Even with my CCAD students, a lot of them are reading manga. So what I'll notice is that like they come in and they draw their panels backwards, like they draw them manga style. Like I think so. We read right to left, so they're going left to right, which is really interesting. So you know, they kind of I like reintroduce them and give them like a formal language for comics. You know, like they might not know what a gutter is, they've seen it a million times. But both my students at OSU and CCAD, they're like learning this language of comics. And in both cases, I'm always getting them to draw. So my OSU students, many of whom, you know, they come from all different backgrounds. They might be engineers or like English majors. Maybe they stopped drawing when they were kids. You know, they can be like, it's very uncomfortable for them to get started drawing. But I think like once they get into it, like I teach them like, and Lynda Berry uses this method, but I teach them like an Ivan Brunetti style, like, which is actually on the screen right now, stick figure that they can use. So my OSU students, there's a little bit of uncomfortability with drawing. And then my CCAD students, sometimes they also feel uncomfortable because I'm like, give me a panel in 10 minutes. And they're like, no, I must have an hour. So, you know, in both cases, they're learning the language of comics by drawing and actually interacting with like the medium, as opposed to just reading comics or thinking about comics in an abstract way. I'll have students do comics essays. I will have them, like most recently in my comics class at CCAD, we talked about the comics code. So I had them draw a pre-code panel, and then I have them revise that panel based on like code regulations. So I try to like enact like whatever we're learning about on the page for them and get them to embody it and get them to draw it and create it themselves. So, and that goes for anyone, like if you can draw or not draw.
Yeah, I love it. While I've got you here, Rachel, maybe you can enlighten me a little bit, or maybe this is an impossible question to be answered. Is there a language for zine that is similar but different to comics? Or what is the difference for, you know, between a zine and a comic? If you were in an elevator and I asked you this question and we had 10 floors before we had to get off.
That's a question that I'm thinking about all the time, this difference between zines and comics. I think zines, like the relationship between text and image is not as straightforward as comics. So with a zine, you can have a page that's just, you can have an entire zine that's just text, you know, handwritten text, typed text, text that you create on a computer. And maybe the image part of it is like the border that you're drawing around that text. Or you can be collaging images that you find other locations, like in magazines, newspapers, all like old media that maybe we don't interface as much now in like a digital moment. But comics, you know, I think there's like more specificity in that relationship between text and image. We have certain expectations of comics. Like they're going to be drawn in some way, whether that's hand drawn or digitally drawn. There's going to be some balance between text and image. Certainly there are comics that like break these conventions. And we also have the expectation that like comics will be narrative in some way. And zines don't have to be narrative. Zines can have a lot of different things going on. They could be manifestos, they can be poems, they can be just collages of images. So yeah, our expectations, I think, for the two different media are much different.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So insightful. You also have curated comics exhibits. I see this as a kind of teaching by other means, but maybe you can tell me like what the impulse is and, you know, what's finally being affirmed and celebrated with these comics exhibits.
Yeah, so the exhibit that I worked on is called Ladies First, a century of women's innovations in comics and cartoon art. And I curated this at the Billy Ireland with Caitlin McGurk, who is a professor here at OSU and also works at the Billy Ireland. And our goal for the show was like, I think with a lot of like exhibitions or work about women's work in comics, it's like, hey, women make comics. So we wanted to like take that as a given and say, okay, we know women make comics, but how can we display the innovations that they've brought to the field? So it's not just a show about women making comics. It's really about taking seriously women's contributions to comics. And the show surveys 100 years of women's work, beginning with suffrage cartooning, in which like you know, these women who are cartooning for suffrage were really changing and transforming the image of the suffragette to as like an advertising solution to like make it palatable to more women to join the movement. And then we move all the way through, you know, graphic novels, mini comics. We have original artwork in the show by Jackie Orms, who is the first Black woman to have several newspaper comic strips. And she actually originated the first upscale Black baby doll, which we have on display in the show as well. So like a lot of firsts and a lot of women who like were trailblazing, not just like making comics, but creating for us a new language and a new way of thinking about and creating comics. So I don't know if I answered your question, but that's kind of like a big snapshot of the show.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a reminder, to me to be careful not to think of women's comics as, even in the most capacious way, a kind of transnational room of one's own, but more actually a significant, deep kind of shaper of the history of planetary comics, right?
Right, like they're really shaping women have shaped the visual culture, like surrounding like very particular issues, like even with the Jackie Orms, like baby doll, for example, you know, this is like recasting the potentials for Black girlhood in a key way, right? So they're contributing to this like bigger vision of women's work in popular culture.
So important. Again, my goodness. Small press expos, I know that's also very important to me and very important to you. You've also been involved in the Small Press Expo. Why are spaces like this so important?
I think, you know, the small spaces like Small Press Expo, Cartoon Crossroads Columbus, SoulCon, like these are the places where like the new generation kind of like gets its footing and begins to find its community and like begins to show what it can really do. Like these are spaces that are very intimate and they foster like a sense of community and like exchange. Like you can run around the show and like trade comics with people, and like you never know like who you're going to meet on the floor. And I've taken students from CCAD to the Small Press Expo, and it's usually like their first comics convention. And you know, just seeing them like experience the show and get to see like this meeting between like these big names and then them at their own table and everyone's on an equal playing field. You know, same with SoulCon. I've taken my CCAD students to SoulCon and introduced them to you or introduced them to various creators there. And it's like the first time where they're like, oh, I belong like in this industry, and like here's my people, you know, here's what I'm going to work for next year. Is I'm going to have a mini comic and be able to, you know, table at SoulCon or table at CXE.
Yeah, so important and so different to what has become the kind of culture of, you know, San Diego Comic-Con, which just I mean, I walk in there and 5 minutes later, I'm ready to like leave and I'm completely exhausted, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, convention, like for someone with social anxiety, conventions are like, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's so much going on. But it's, you know, these smaller conventions, they're much more like personal and you feel more at home there, I think. At least I do.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
So Rachel, where are you seeing, you've got so many of these amazing book projects that you're working on, but where are you seeing the vitality in comics and comic studies today?
I mean, I really, you know, like I have to shout out like my own cohort of comic studies scholars that are coming up right now. You know, people like Francesca Lynn, Adrienne Resha, Margaret Galvin, like, you know, early career scholars who are really pushing the boundaries of what comic studies can be. I think we're seeing a lot more like hybrid academics. I consider myself one of these where it's like, yeah, I do academia, but I'm also like in the arts communities and like, you know, I'm making my own work, like whether that's comics or like I'm writing creatively. I am working on my own comic now, so that's exciting. But yeah, so I really see like the vitality in comic studies coming from like my generation and then the generation after us, like pushing into the field and introducing like a new way to think about the field through practice and through scholarship.
Right. And because of that incredibly vital sort of intersection between critical and the maker, the practice and the scholarship, asking different questions, right? And generating from that deeper, maybe kind of knowledge about the field and in all of these different ways. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, and it's like the generation before us, like you guys have created the way for us. And I think that like, I just see comic studies exploding in this really exciting way with my generation and younger generations coming up.
Me too. So what is next besides, I know you're working on all these books and you've just mentioned a comic book that you're creating. And maybe you want to talk a little bit about that, but also, you know, what are you seeing down the road for you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm working on a couple different projects. The books that I've talked about are always like, you know, I'm trying to refine that research and publish it in some way, whether it's, you know, getting a manuscript out there or articles. I'm working on, I just proposed with Andrew Kunka a textbook for Introduction to Comic Studies. We just proposed that, so that's kind of in the works. I can't say too much about that. And then I am working on a comic with my partner, Brian Moss. He's drawing it and I'm writing it. And it is a comic about a teenage girl who runs a cult in Florida. So it's like, it's a little dark, a little definitely like in the teen comics genre, but it's been fun to work on as like a break from you know, doing scholarship. And it's also very satisfying when you're working with an artist and you're like, here's my vision for, you know, what the page is going to look like, and then they do it and you're like, oh my gosh, like there's such like immediate gratification in that process. So yeah, so that's I'm working on a bunch of projects as always and teaching comics, so I'm pretty happy with it.
I love it. And
Yeah.
I love everything that you do. I'm a big fan of yours, as you know. I want to publish. I'm greedy for everything you do. So I always want to be like first in line for whatever you write, so I can publish it. But gosh, Rachel, thanks for sharing your journey and so much insight into comics, comic studies, your work, and where you see the vitality of comic studies in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me. And, you know, it's always such an honor to work with you. So I'm also a fan of yours. But